it'd be better if we sent it on the WhatsApp group, or whichever you're comfortable with, because we wouldn't like to interrupt you while you're speaking.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, Professor Anwar,
Yeah,
this is perfect. We can see it in full screen.
Okay.
Thank you.
So, do you want me to stop sharing now? Yeah.
Yes. Thank you so much.
I think I might prefer the reminder on the Zoom chat just because it'll come up on the screen. I may not look at my phone when I'm presenting.
Great, sounds good.
I would also prefer if it's on the chat because it can just be seen.
Great. We'll be sharing a reminder 10 minutes to wrap up and 5 minutes to wrap up. And the modern session also 10 minutes to wrap up and 5 minutes to wrap up. So yeah, I think we're good to go then. So we have 4 minutes remaining. We'll be starting at 11:30 sharp. We'll let in the attendees at that time. So moderators, do you have anything to say? Or is there anything that you'd like to ask? Be a good time to warm up.
We actually met beforehand and we had a bit of a talk. So we are okay. We're good to go, I think.
All right, that's great. All the best to everyone then. We'll be starting soon. Request everyone to keep their videos off during the introduction and the speakers to keep their videos on while they are speaking. And during the moderation session, everybody keeps their videos on.
Okay.
All right. Thank you.
Welcome once again, and we really look forward to this session.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Good morning. Welcome to Design United's first South Asian Legacy series. Design United is a platform for regional connection and collaboration and opportunities for emerging designers and students of design from South Asia. Here is a short film about Design United.
In a socially distanced world,
Good morning.
Design United is an
Welcome to
optimistic
Design
digital
United's
platform
first
for
South
collaborative
Asian
design
Legacy
and connection.
series.
Design United,
Design
was
United
created in March 2020
is a platform for regional
during a
connection
period of
and
intense
collaboration and
lockdown
opportunities
quarantine
for
measures
emerging
within the
designers
region.
and students of design
The
from
aim
South
behind
Asia.
Design United
Here is
was
a
to
short
create
film
an
about Design
optimistic
United.
space for regional dialogue, connections, collaborations, and opportunities for
In a
young
socially
regional
distanced
designers
world,
and
Good
design
morning.
Design United is an
Welcome to
optimistic
Design
digital
United's
platform
first
for
South
collaborative
Asian
design
Legacy
and connection
series.
during these uncertain times.
Design
Was
United
created in March 2020
is a platform for
during
regional
a
connection
period of
and
intense
collaboration and
working on
opportunities
quarantine
for emerging
measures within the
designers
region.
and students of design from South Asia. Here is a short film about Design United.
To be a part for regional dialogue, connections, we also collaborate design students and opportunities from the region
socially
to
distanced
share their
world.
work.
Good morning.
Design United is an
Welcome to Design United's first South Asian Legacy series.
during these Design United
Design
was
United
created in March 2020
is a platform for regional connection and collaboration and opportunities for emerging designers and
Hi, everyone. We apologize. There's been an issue on the audio side of our presentation. So we'll just be resharing the video again. So please bear with us. Thank you.
In a socially distanced world,
Design United is an optimistic digital platform for collaborative design and connection. Design United was created in March 2020 during a period of intense lockdown and quarantine measures within the region. The aim behind Design United was to create an optimistic space for regional dialogue, connections, collaborations, and opportunities for young regional designers and design practices. A much needed network of support and peer mentorship during these uncertain times. Talented young designers and design studios working on design innovation with an approach that is relevant to our South Asian region have been invited to be a part of the platform. We also encourage design students from the region to share their work, be involved in the dialogue, and to be an active part of Design United. Design United, most of all, believes in creating a community of designers and design knowledge that is largely contextual, with focus on contributing to the environment and our community. Design United believes greatly in a spirit of collaboration and idea exchange.
A warm welcome to Design United's first South Asian Legacy series, where we will discover the works and approach of two South Asian Modernist masters, architect Valentine Gunasekara from Sri Lanka and architect Iit Kanpur from India through the lens of our distinguished presenters. I'm Varna Shashidhar, a landscape architect with a Bangalore-based practice, and I'm supported by my Design United team and Claywork spaces. Sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, Vanna,
Yes.
I can hear you.
Thank you. Sorry for the disturbance. I'm supported by my Design United team and Claywork spaces. I'm extremely privileged to introduce today's presenters, architect, historian Anoma Pires from Sri Lanka, who is an architectural historian and professor at the University of Melbourne in Australia. She has published extensively on topics of nationalism, citizenship, and sovereignty. Her seminal book, published in 2007, Imagining Modernity, The Architecture of Valentine Gunasekara, will be released as an e-book next week on 21st August. Welcome, Professor Anoma Pires. I'm also extremely honored to introduce architect Tanuja BK, partner at Kanvende, Rai and Chaudhary, New Delhi, and professor at School of Planning and Architecture, New Delhi. She has had the privilege of being mentored by Modernist masters Joseph Allen Stein, Murad Chaudhary, and architect Iit Kanpur. She has been creating sustainable built environments of varied scales and continuing the legacy of architect Kanvende's practice with her partner Sanjay Kanvende. Welcome, architect Tanuja. We're also extremely privileged to be joined by Brinda Kanvende, her daughter, architect Tanuja's daughter, who is an aspiring architectural critic and a recent graduate of the MDes program at Harvard's Graduate School of Design. She has had her bachelor's degree in architecture from University School of Architecture and Planning, New Delhi. They will be sharing their research on the Indian Modernist master, architect Iit Kanpur. Welcome, Brinda. We also warmly welcome our moderators for today's conversation. We will be joined by talented young architects Devi Nair from India, who is a recent MDes candidate at the Yale School of Architecture, where her research is based on gendered spaces in the 15th century Kerala. She has an MSc in architecture from Tampere University, Finland, and a B.Arch from India. Our second moderator for today is Irushi Guruge from Sri Lanka, who is a recent graduate from the Masters of Architecture program from CSA Colombo. Irushi shares a deep interest in research-based design process. Welcome, Irushi and Devi. With this, I request Professor Anuma to start her presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Varna. Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So thank you to Varna, Sakshi, and the Design United team for organizing this event and for hosting me and arranging these excellent moderators, and also coupling with me with such important speakers. I was excited at this invitation because a week from now, on the 21st August, a newly formed Sri Lankan publishing house, Tambapani Academic Publishers, will be launching an ebook on Valentine Gunasekara. It is already available online through various platforms. I'm hoping that because it is inexpensive and readily available, Gunasekara's work will have greater dissemination than previously. The many people who have assisted me, included here, are too many to mention by name. And this is in relation to the 2007 book and also the ebook that is coming out. I would like to acknowledge particularly and thank Valentine Gunasekara's partner Rani and his son Surain for their continuing support. While researching the book in Bedford and California, I got to know the Gunasekara family very well. He was a remarkable teacher. We spent many days over several visits poring over his working drawings. Mathematics and music were among his passions. I am honored to share his work with you today. Many of you would not have heard of Valentine Gunasekara. You may be familiar with Jeffrey Bava, who has many publications on his work, and Minette de Silva, who has recently attracted much attention, most recently in Architectural Record. Both these architects are familiar and famous for synthesizing vernacular, formal, and aesthetic elements into their designs. Bava is celebrated for his wide range of projects, most notably the Sri Lankan Parliament, and De Silva is known for her international networking, her presence at CIAM, her formative contribution to MAG, and commitment to developing a regional architecture rooted in the Lankan cultural context, a commitment which Bava, in collaboration with the Danish architect Ulrik Plesner, developed into an idiomatic style. Gunasekara stands out as an anomaly in this architectural legacy of vernacular-derived forms we associate with Sri Lanka. In many ways, he's similar to Iit Kanpur and Mazharul Islam, architects who, influenced by US education, introduced that strain of international modernism to South Asia. Although, like De Silva and Bava, Gunasekara was educated at the London Architectural Association School, notably in the tropical program, he was guided not by Britain's colonial or modernist traditions, but by the continental and American approach. Born in Colombo, Ceylon in 1931 to a close-knit Catholic middle-class family, Gunasekara's childhood was made precarious by the early death of his father. His family struggled financially, and when his older brother funded his architectural education overseas, he was conscientious and frugal. This financial instability characterized his introspective approach when compared with his more flamboyant contemporaries. At the time, there were no architectural courses in Ceylon. When compared with his two peers, both senior to him at the AA, Gunasekara was more representative of Ceylon's post-colonial middle class. However, neither of these three individuals subscribed to the overtly ethno-religious symbolism of state architecture, like the university at Peradeniya, with its references to temples and palaces. Perhaps it was because they were all three from minority groups. Bava and De Silva were Eurasian. Gunasekara was a Catholic. Instead, they were inspired by the sense of a cohesive collective identity forged by political independence in 1948. Gunasekara, having neither wealth nor political connections like his two contemporaries, embodied the spirit of a generation who emerged through decolonization to seize opportunities that had been unavailable to them previously. They were able to migrate from the small outlying towns to the new suburbs of a booming metropolis and to gain tertiary education in the new universities set up at independence. Women who traditionally had been unable to seek higher education eagerly entered local institutions. They were among Gunasekara's clients. I have called them vernacular cosmopolitans after Homi Bhabha's use of that term to describe people who are unsophisticated but aspirational, and consequently unlikely to be sentimental about their rural roots. I have also described Bhabha's architecture as a cosmopolitan vernacular, the opposite of that, a return to the vernacular from a position of urban sophistication, seeking a kind of synthesis. Because they are not commissioned by elite clients on large properties with beautiful gardens, the architecture of vernacular cosmopolitans is often overlooked. But they are integral to Lanka's decolonization story, part of the extraordinary and ordinary architecture that I grew up with. Before independence in 1948, there were two main options for architectural practice, either in colonial firms or in the public works department. Gunasekara apprenticed at Edwards, Reed and Beck alongside Geoffrey Bava. Returning to Lanka after his education at the AA, he rejoined the practice, but became increasingly dissatisfied with the direction it was taking. Bava, influenced by De Silva's work in Kandy and in partnership with the Danish architect Ulrik Plesner, was experimenting with vernacular-derived aesthetics. Gunasekara, in contrast, experimented with modernism, far more directly, seduced by the plasticity of concrete. Sri Lanka's economy and political culture was at a watershed. The Sri Lanka Freedom Party favored socialist policies, and the industrial exhibition of 1965 featured daring feats of engineering using concrete, the material that had entered the economy for building dams and roads. Gunasekara's pavilion for Samuel and Sons, an engineering company, tested the tropical modernist agenda. Visitors to the exhibition embraced this newfound modernity and the sophistication and internationalization it suggested to them. But the opaque oil crisis of 1973 brought this experimentation to a standstill. Gunasekara's career diverged sharply from that of his contemporaries. He was awarded a Rockefeller Travel Grant to tour North America throughout 1966. The prestigious award funded visits to many architectural practices, where he met influential modernist designers of the mid-20th century. He arrived at Eero Saarinen's TWA terminal and marveled at its curvaceous lines. He was captivated by the freedom to engineer a form that had no historical precedent, something that was extremely daring to him. He traveled to St. Louis and saw the Jefferson Memorial Arch. Saarinen had passed away, so he worked for 6 months at the architect's former firm under its new principal, Kevin Roche. Gunasekara was animated by the possibility of shedding elite traditions or ethno-religious associations, but more importantly, of breaking out of the box-like colonial PWD bungalow forms, which during the war years had assumed an introverted austerity. He traveled across America to meet Louis Kahn in Pennsylvania, to Taliesin, the Cranbrook Academy, and eventually to California and south to Mexico. He found the clear blue skies, the vast horizons, and warm, sunny climate of Southern California with its ubiquitous ocean views appealing and evocative of Sri Lanka's climate and scenography. Khan and the Eameses, Charles and Ray Eames, were working on projects in South Asia, the exhibition on Nehru, the Dhaka Capital Complex, and discussed these with him. Richard Neutra's work, particularly for the case study houses, had the most lasting impact. California modernism became internationalized during the 1960s and 70s and gradually replaced colonial patterns for domestic architecture in former colonies. In Lanka, this was called the American style. It was disseminated mainly through magazines like Ideal Homes and Better Homes and Gardens, closely following key attributes of the case study homes, such as textured external walls, L-shaped plans wrapped around a garden, and views to it through French windows. With roofing sheets, the roof pitch could be at different angles, permitting daring experimentations like for the butterfly roof. Gunasekara's first ever design, shown here, drawn up during his student days in London, followed this pattern. The American style house was a precursor to modernism in Sri Lanka, and the vernacular-derived architecture of Bava and De Silva occurred in tandem and in reaction to it. In their work, the free plan and the airy light-filled interiors and views to the outdoors were housed in a hybridized form, marrying tropical modernist architecture with vernacular spatial experiences and material expressions rooted in place. In 1969, having left ER&B to begin his own practice, Gunasekara became more avowedly modernist in his approach, synthesizing the clean lines and framed views of California modernism and the sinuous engineering of Saarinen into an architecture that seemed alien to the Lankan context. But it was embraced by middle-class clients. The changed ideals of domesticity caused by universal access to education and creation of new universities meant that modernity and professionalization were co-constitutive. Father to 8 children with a strong-willed and intelligent partner, Rani, his designs explored family living at a time when nuclear families were becoming common due to in-migration into and congestion in the city. The VJH Gunasekara house built for his brother is one of my favorite projects. In this wonderful axonometric drawn by Milinda Pathiraja, you can see how, due to the expense and scarcity of timber at the time, he cleverly eliminates the need for doors. Gunasekara's sketches for numerous small houses designed in suburban Colombo depict his emulation of modernist drawing traditions, as well as annotation in Sinhalese for the village masons who were employed on his projects. He speaks fondly of Siripala and Sirisoma, whose careers he hoped to advance by introducing them to complex concrete construction and making contractors of them. The Ilanga Cone House typifies his approach. It has multiple courtyards and terraces and few dividing walls, but the whole is contained in an urban corner property. Given this condition, the roof terrace becomes an important innovation, a space from where the resident family can watch the sunset and moonrise. And this was very important for Gunasekara. Outside the congested morphology of the city, his focus was on experiential aspects of the terrain, abstracted using a modernist vocabulary. The Elepatha house in Ratnapura seems to grow out of the rubble walls used to retain the contours of the steep rubber plantation landscape. The house is broken up into rooms and courtyards. The roof forms are concealed so that the house seems like a medieval fort. Throughout his career, Gunasekara would be challenged by the need to be modern and express that modernity, deploying forms and materials that were unfamiliar to indigenous masons, steel and concrete. The roof, what to do with it, how to reveal it or conceal it, would become a preoccupation, just as its augmentation would become an iconic feature of Bawa's work. At times, in urban settings, like the Jesuit chapel in Bamlapitia, a vaulted concrete structure was utilized. The forms appear reminiscent of the Mexican vernacular and suggested the billowing ocean waves at the end of the street. The contractor for this was his close friend, Christopher Fonseca, for whom he also built a house. At other times, as in the chapel for the Sisters of Providence at Tevata, a rural village setting, he tried to reconcile a modernist structure with a pitched roof. The nautilus shape of the building plan and the fact that it was not axial responded to the Second Vatican Council's changed directives for congregation. At St. Martin de Porres Church, Corona, the shell roof structure opens up the church to the congregation arriving from the surrounding hills. So you can see that in these three examples of the church, he's always trying to find ways to create roofs that take the shape of the roofs that are in the community, but are built with different materials. Both this and the next example of St. Anthony's Montessori School in Borella are reminiscent of familiar modernist works, leading to the question whether this work is derivative. This critique is often directed at South Asian modernists, part of the post-colonial antipathy towards Western ideals of universality and secularism crafted in a distinctive Western aesthetic. But the careers of these architects are highly reflexive and rooted in efforts to interpret modernism for the local context, not overt displays of symbolism, but more subtle interpretations of a decolonized sensibility. The license they took in introducing novel aesthetic forms and elements did not accord with the nationalist sentiments of that era that sought to reconnect with an uncontaminated pre-colonial past. Perhaps the most ingenious of Gunasekara's buildings, the Tango Bay Hotel, stands out as very different from the tropical resorts being built along the southern coastline at that time. And these examples that I show here are his commercial buildings, which sort of preceded the creation of the Tango Bay Hotel. For this, he collaborated with Christopher de Serum and engineer Jayati Veerakoon. This was the era when import substitution crippled the economy, even as membership in the non-aligned movement strengthened self-determination in the face of the Cold War. Designed using models and meticulous working drawings and incremental planning of phased construction, the design conveys the experience on board a birch ocean liner about to set sail. This allusion is significant because Lankans were too impoverished to afford overseas travel at the time. Walking along the gangway with its views to the ocean, the sinuous lines of the public spaces and surf-splashed cascading terraced rooms convey a nautical sensibility. This building was much loved and used by locals for weddings and celebrations because its human scale and accessibility made it seem more grounded than the gated coastal resorts. Gunasekara did not remain in Sri Lanka. Like many middle-class design professionals, the long era of socialism affected his practice, and he left looking for work first to the US and then to Nigeria. The provocation for his final departure from Lanka was his failure to win the competition for the Sri Lanka Institute of Architects headquarters building in 1982. The roof is a dominant feature in his unbuilt scheme. It is a test case for the deconstructivist aesthetic that gained acclaim elsewhere. It was judged second place in favor of a more conservative pitched roof proposal, which was built and served as a Colombo-based architectural school. A disillusioned Gunasekara emigrated to the USA in 1987, teaching at Boston's Wentworth Institute of Technology until his retirement. Without capital or a client base, he was unable to set up his own architectural practice overseas. The egalitarian sensibility of an imagined modernity that would mobilize a new class consciousness unconnected to agrarian or elite norms of past habitation did not take hold. The break was too radical. The aspirations polemical to the desire to create an uninterrupted sense of cultural continuity. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Noma. That was a rather insightful talk into Gunasekara's life and work, and the drawings that you showed us were really beautiful. We'd like to continue this conversation during the moderation session, but before that, we'd like to move to Architect Tanuja and Brinda's presentation. So may I please invite them to share their screens.
Good morning. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you so much to Team Design United and to Padna for inviting us. It's such an honor to be speaking alongside Anoma. Tanuja and I will be presenting together, so we'll be sharing a presentation. She will be speaking about the monograph that the firm brought out on Kanvende's work, and I'll be speaking about my thesis research this last semester at the GST. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, it's visible.
Okay. The house sits on a corner plot, one boundary wall shared by a neighbor, the other abutting the colony park. Through the foliage, you glimpse the exposed brickwork facade, standing stately and unmoving. Its straight, orthogonal lines and narrow off-center fenestrations give nothing away. From the front of the house, you don't see the inclined roofs or the levels above. It's only when viewed from the side do the playful forms and inclines emerge, the forms that earned the house the name Akar. The play of levels slowly ascends towards the far side, culminating in a sloping roof. The house unfolds in stages. First, the gradual rise of the driveway, then up the entrance steps, till you reach the landing with its pivoted teak main door. The space is intentionally constricted, only to be flung open into a double-height atrium after a gradual descent to the living room on the right. The monolithic brick wall extends double-storied and straight through to the roof, standing as a backdrop to the central atrium and meeting the inclined ceiling of the living room in a skylight. The various skylights and windows into the atrium space afford different light at different times of the day. This is the house that my grandfather built. I marvel at the knack some parents have for choosing names that perfectly suit the future personalities of their children. Or am I getting it wrong? Do the names become self-fulfilling prophecies? Much as the house was named Akar, my grandfather was named Achyut Purushottam Kanvende. Achyut means infallibility, stability, and firmness. He was born in 1916 in a small village in Western India. The son of an artist, he moved to Mumbai to study architecture, having been told that it was a more lucrative profession than art. Prior to his modernist exposure, my grandfather had been instructed by Claude Batley at the Sir J.J. School of Art in Mumbai. Through his student work, it is evident that drawing was a tool essentially for documenting monuments. For Nehru specifically, himself a product of modernist tradition and often lauded as the architect of modern India for his development of science and technology and the industrialization of India, modernism was representative of an egalitarian society through the sway of socialism. It was under this agenda that prior to famously inviting Le Corbusier to design Chandigarh, the government sent young architects abroad for further studies to America and England to then be tasked with rebuilding a new, modern nation on returning. My grandfather, by this time working for the government at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research, was one of the first to be sent abroad to specialize in laboratory design. He studied at Harvard under the tutelage of Walter Gropius between 1946 and 47. Architecture then, as now, was, to quote John May, based on repetition and the technologic of the precedent, which carried in its mechanical, gestural, medial structure, overlaying, tracing, redrawing, the geometric heritage of past instances of order, proportion, and symbolic expression. Due to this system, students had a chance to work directly under modernist masters with the development of a resultant mimetic mode, and they each emerged metonymical Nehrus in their own fields. Although Kanvende held a significant position within this growing discourse on Indian identity in modernism and was by then hailed as a doyen of Indian modernism, his contribution was perceived in a limited manner in terms of dissemination of a Gropius-inspired approach to the early nation-building program. I, however, would categorize his work slightly differently. While most of his contemporaries pivoted to postmodernism, Kanvende continued to create architecture that was still very much modernist in vocabulary and yet deeply suited to context and climate.
Kanvende, with a handful of his contemporaries, paved the way for the modernist movement in India. As very common for those times, though Kanvende with his partner Shaukat Rai had designed a large number of projects, there was limited documentation about the works and the philosophy of the firm. That was the impetus for us to bring out a monograph on Kanvende. There were many false starts, beginning 2000, and it was only in 2015, at the start of the centenary year, the commitment to completing the task became real. On the 9th of February 2015, a few of his contemporaries and associates were invited for a celebration, and it was amazing to hear what they had to say even so many years after he and Shaukat had passed away. It is then that we realized that the firm was sitting on a wealth of archival material, and it was absolutely unfair to not share it with the fraternity. By this time, it was also much easier for us to view it objectively and distance ourselves emotionally. While Sanjay and myself would do all it needed to provide the material, Sunita, his daughter, herself a graphic designer, would ensure a well laid out manuscript. It thus became a family venture, a labor of love. The studio then appointed a dedicated team to work on the task of documentation. The following years saw Sanjay Kanvende and the team spent innumerable hours over the invaluable drawings on very fragile tracing paper. On the 9th of February 2016, at a seminar specially organized to celebrate the legacy of Kanvende and Shaukat, we managed a soft launch of Aakar at Azad Bhavan. That manuscript facilitated Mr. Vikas Niyogi of Niyogi Books to undertake the publishing. This morning, I'll be taking you through the making and the structure of the monograph, and also about the philosophy of the practice in the words of Kanvende. One thing we decided fairly early on in the journey was that we would limit it to just documentation of the projects, which would then lend itself to continued analysis and interpretation in the future. To begin with, the large issue was the manner in which the projects would be depicted. But soon enough, on looking at all the projects, we realized that there was a definite shift in Kanvende's approach and style almost every decade. We then decided to document the projects chronologically rather than on typology. We were also very particular about wanting a plan and a section in addition to images for each of the projects selected. Similarly, we looked at using the sketches made by Kanvende, which were an integral part of the client presentation for a project. We were lucky here that Niyogi Books agreed to insert these views printed on trays and paper as a fold-out, which we felt connected with and which would have a great memory recall value with the fraternity. To position the work of Kanvende and considering his humanistic qualities, we were clear about wanting essays by the fraternity who were not only from the academia, but had a personal connect with him. His long-term friend and associate, Professor B.V. Doshi, kindly consented to write the foreword. We invited professors Ashok Lal, Miki Desai, and Narendra Dengle to share their thoughts on the practice of Kanvende and Rai, later known as Kanvende Rai and Chaudhary, after Murad Chaudhary joined the partnership. Sanjay Kanvende wrote Anveshan, The Quest, about the people and places that influenced Kanvende, the essence and the dimension of his practice, and him as a father. While looking through his papers, we were delighted to come across some writings where Kanvende had penned down his thoughts on varied issues. We decided, therefore, to use that treasure in the manuscript as is, in his own words. We also have a compilation of all the projects that the firm undertook since its inception, along with the unrealized projects. Today, I'll take you through Kanvende's thoughts on his early days and a few of the projects. Starting with his early days, Kanvende says, as a matter of fact, nobody in the family knew what architecture was about that time. And when the stage of joining JJ School came about, it was primarily to get a job as a draftsman. Though I had joined private art classes, I decided to change my mind as a family member thought that there is no opportunity of work for artists, and the idea of joining architecture came about. After enrolling for architectural education, Kanvende reminisces. The JJ School in those days laid great emphasis on the classical style of studies and presentation. It had no such philosophy of any kind and was greatly influenced by classical European practices. Claude Batley, who was the head of the architecture department at that time, had no clear philosophy of his own. However, he was a strong advocate of traditional values, which at times meant adopting architectural embellishments of the past. Though as students, we could not appreciate these values, studying history made us more aware of the world situation in course of time. On finishing his graduation in 1942, he worked with the PWD Jaipur, subsequently with W.W. Wood and Sons, New Delhi. On reaching the US in 1946, he and his colleague Shaukat Rai enrolled themselves at the Harvard School of Design. Kanvende says, unlike the JJ School, Harvard was an altogether different environment. Design was a compulsory subject while others were electives. Fortunately for me, the first design project that I worked on was collaborative in nature, where students worked in teams. This helped me get used to the work environment and acquiring an overall understanding of the system. Other students in the class helped and guided me through the process. Gropius was an active jury member and gave crits in the design studio. His criticism was open to all, and he always welcomed observers' questions. Gropius's oratory skills and confidence thrilled me no end. The enthusiasm that he was able to generate in the students was unmatched. Gropius's ideology and his contribution were the stimulants in the evolution of modern architecture. He will always be remembered as a great teacher and philosopher. I must acknowledge my tremendous debt to Gropius. It was he who really exposed me to the power of technology on the one hand and the psychological dimension of spatial concerns and realizations on the other. The most important thing about teaching methodology at Harvard was the exposure to leading professionals and the study of history of modern architecture, which helped Kanvende set a frame of reference towards architectural design. Ashok Lal in his essay, Achut Kanvende and His Time, says, the year is 1945. Two young professionals, Achut Kanvende, an architect, and Shaukat Rai, an engineer, depart together on a sponsorship for a study tour to the US. One can only imagine how the energy of an emergent new nation, waiting to be freed of its shackles of colonial rule, hopeful of building its own future, founded on modern institutions and armed with new knowledge, would be coursing through the veins of these two young men. The bond between the architect and the engineer was to endure through life. Narendra Dengle, in his essay, Achut Kanvende in Modernism in India, says, Kanvende and Rai, later Kanvende Rai and Chaudhary, established themselves as an exemplary professional practice that was known for professional integrity and managing a good blend of engineering and architectural services. What makes Kanvende's architecture memorable and significant beyond his times, and what would the current generation learn from his work? For this, one must take a closer look at how he practiced. Besides professionalism and the support staff, he had in his office a very able engineer partner in Shaukat Rai and later also in Murad Chaudhary. Shaukat Rai once stated that he insulated Kanvende from the mundane aspects of work such as contractual hassles, municipal follow-up, site issues, and managing the engineering and account staff employed at the office. But besides that backup, Kanvende knew that his strength lay in his design sensibilities and ability to educate and persuade the client to look at things his way. Looking at some of the projects, after they set up the practice, the quote, can I just have the quote, please? The quote actually sums it all up. Architectural practice is a never-ending process, which one keeps on accumulating and experiencing as one progresses. Over the years, I've come to believe that it's imperative that an architect develop sensitivity to human nature and a respect for human values. This, after all, is the very core of his work. I'm going to just take you through a few of the projects where Kanvende had written in his own words of what the philosophy behind it was. And some of these projects happened almost around the same time or one succeeding the other. So it was interesting to kind of see what he felt about it. This is Azad Bhavan. When I look back to the early period, I find that I was somewhat trapped in the so-called international style. Since early works from 1950 in the design of research laboratories, offices, and residences in Ahmedabad, although several of our projects had many common factors, there was one project which was different, and that was Azad Bhavan in Delhi. While discussing the project, no mention was made about the requirements, but Maulana Azad, who was then the president of Council of Cultural Relations, started describing about the physical aspects of the building in the name of culture. He mentioned that the building has to have domes, arches, turrets, etc. And everybody blindly supported him and stayed quiet. While as the young CSIR architect, I started commenting, saying that the characteristics of historical architecture is the product of knowledge and technology of the past and way of life of that time. And that while we may have association of the past, present-day architecture has to have expression of technology of present time. To his credit, Maulana Azad reacted, saying what you said is also correct and can be adopted. Kanvende says, though the building was well received and published in design magazines, I did not attempt a similar approach in other works. The next that we look at are two houses which he did about the same time in the 60s. There is a sudden change of direction in my work after 1965. Balkrishna Harivallabh's residence was completed in 1964 and my house was completed in 67. Both have a theme and a strong expression of purpose. Harivallabh's house emphasized the solar envelope against heat and landscape at various levels, including a sunk garden. My home has a central atrium around which all activities are organized with transparency by expressing the inner and the outer spaces, including landscaped areas. One of his very known works is Iit Kanpur. Reflecting on my earlier experience, I had a feeling that I was surviving on knowledge gained in Harvard, and there was a sense of stagnation in the approach and a feeling of dissatisfaction. I had to search for setting my own direction by coming out of the clutches of the so-called modern architecture. This was the time I started assessing my work independently, also trying to search for deeper meaning and values associated with architecture I was also observing the works of some senior established professionals, including my contemporaries in the US, and reading provocative articles by recognized authors. Some of the works of known architects and writers led me to realize the deeper values and meanings associated with physical and also psychological needs that contribute to the evolution of a firm. It was a constant search for deeper understanding associated with human environment to architecture, rather than merely following cliches in the name of modern and also postmodern architecture as pattern. When the design of Iit Kanpur was assigned to me, I was faced with new problems and challenges and overtaken partly by the desire to depart and search for solutions peculiar to the problem. The need to depart from the earlier rigid and large mass to meet the functional needs on one hand and the search for a human scale on the other led the complex to be resolved into a cluster formation, creating greater transparency of landscape spaces. During the process, three things influenced my thinking, which was ultimately incorporated in the design. These were: one, the whole program was dissected and broken into a clustered form to establish a human scale. Second, building activities were connected with corridors, allowing two levels of movement, ensuring expansion of all activities. And the third, service distribution using an underground corridor to serve various establishments of the campus. Dengle in his essay says, time and again, Kanvende seems to first solve the sequence by composing functions and plans and converts them into volumes that are composed by linking or delinking a group of functions. Functional composition, volumetric play, simplicity in choice of materials, and avoidance of unnecessary articulation are normative in his work. In between spaces, bridge-like volumes, free columns, composition of function-wise detached volumes, one space where or through which most people would pass or may casually meet holds his architecture together. One is at once taken by the delicacy of form of his buildings and the rationality of approach to the campus planning for movement and activity location. Moving around, one is always comfortable in Kanvende's buildings because of the appropriation of natural light and movement of air. The spatiality of Kanvende's projects had an entirely different openness than contemporary modern brutalist architecture in the US, to which it comes the nearest. The architecture is the crystallized physical expression of culture projected into space and form. He takes this forward in his attempt with the two museums. Nehru Science Center, Mumbai, has characteristics which are not usual. The need to use forced ventilation and artificial light resulted in the introduction of structure using columns as ventilation shaft, which gets reflected in the expression of the building with its own peculiarities. National Science Center, Delhi, presents a building as a large-size crystal with facilities for indoor and outdoor exhibition areas at all levels. It introduced vertical shafts to serve several purposes, such as for elevators, ventilation needs, and also for unforeseen future services. The circulation is introduced in a way that the public rise to the top through the escalator and descend down gradually to the lowest level through the exhibition areas before they depart. It is important to recognize the central idea in the case of both the projects. Since the museum is a center of learning, it's essential to have an environment in a building which can set a mood and generate excitement and interest that helps in the receptivity of mind. While meeting all building considerations, an effort is made in these projects that while fulfilling the needs, it can become symbolic. The basic idea behind the museum design is to use elements of repetitive modules, which in their application would be expected to create regimentation. To overcome such a thing, modules are made of different volumes while using a common structural denominator. At the same time, they are twisted and connected to each other in a varied manner, creating variation of interest, yet maintaining commonality and integrity. Though both the projects have a common ideology, the form of expression is different in terms of quality of space and overall visual experience. One of the things a designer experiences in the pursuit of the project is that when he does get himself caught in an old situation or a solution, then backed by the intensity of search, he arrives at an answer which is appropriate and befitting the need and peculiarities of the problem. He also did 2 institute projects based in Pune around the same time. One was the NIA and the other the NIBM. The other projects which are significant and which are a departure from the earlier work are the National Institute of Bank Management and the National Insurance Academy, both located in Pune. NIBM, the first one, was inspired by the use of traditional local building materials, that is the Deccan trap stone, and the complex has taken a form with spaces to create humanistic and intimate environmental qualities. As the complex had normal training at junior level and also one for executive training program, it was thought desirable to create a condition of environment which is not awe-inspiring, but intimate and friendly. NIA is essentially made more like a traditional ashram, a seminary where participants work and live at one place. In the above complex, the participants are separated by a corridor in the form of a bridge that connects the hostel and the academy areas together. The bridge meant to be a meeting place overlooking the landscaped garden spaces, and also with the movement close to the library makes access to it inviting. Kanvende towards the later years also designed a large number of master plan projects. By the nature and scale of the projects, he would team with professionals from the affiliated fields, form a consortium while being the team leader. The Ronagiri township in Navi Mumbai, Sindhudurg headquarters at Oris in the west coast of Maharashtra, and the central business district at Shadra, Delhi are some of the master plan projects. Detailed models made in wood at varying scales were an integral part of the design development. His swan song was the ISKCON temple at New Delhi. Here his quest for spatial concepts took on a sculpturist form by adopting innovative contemporary technology and prevalent material. To conclude, in his contemporary Pritzker laureate Doshi's words, for me, Kanvende's life and practices can be termed as parampara, an ongoing living tradition.
Thank you. So while the monograph on Kanvende was largely an exercise in documentation, through my thesis, I actually looked at trying to do a more critical analysis of his work. And so though it started out as a quest for tracking the development of his style, it slowly emerged into a far more complex question of authorship. And so my eventual thesis topic was tracing architectural authorship through the archive of Indian modernist Achut Kanvende. And I did this through 3 frames. So through the first frame, I introduced Kanvende to the uninitiated with a survey of his body of work. It's never an easy task to analyze an architect's work, but if one were to try and eke out the essence of Kanvende's, one can ascertain that it's not one single defining characteristic, but a combination of factors that form various iterations. While his work constantly evolved over time, thereby defying a chronological slotting, certain principles and elements remained fairly consistent through his long career. So I looked at 5 iterations of his work. The first being the Bauhaus transplant, or the L or distorted pinwheel type. The second, experiments with exposed brick and concrete. The third, experiments with grit finish, ascending forms, chamfered edges. The fourth, modularity, further experiments with grit finish and sloped roof lights. And the fifth, traditional Hindu motifs, marble and sandstone cladding. The first iteration, naturally, involved the deployment of all Kanvende learned during his time with Gropius at Harvard. Most of the plan configurations involve either a distorted pinwheel or an opened up courtyard with one arm forming an L shape. The term transplant here, or diffusion, is from the legal sense, and since there's an almost formulaic response to grief. The body of work with the establishment of Kanvende and Rai in 1955 breaks away from the stylistic reproduction of modernist formal language. This phase of experimentation was exemplified by exposed brick and distinctly articulated concrete members and the use of courtyards enclosed partially by linear walkways. Another project representative of this phase is Kanvende's own house. The next iteration is the beginning of what most historians consider Kanvende's brutalist phase. This marks the beginning of his use of grit finish, as well as the ascending forms that will come to dominate the next decade of his work. These buildings are characterized by their massive monolithic forms with a rigid geometry, mostly chamfered cuboidal forms, forming either spires or terraces, and the large-scale use of poured concrete. In the case of Ashoka Estate and Broadway Hotel, the chamfer takes place not at the upper edge of the cuboid, but a lower level, creating an almost flying buttress-like effect and slightly recessed upper levels. While his early work exhibited large rectilinear forms, they gradually evolved into smaller, more comprehensible units over time. The next stage in development occurs in the 80s, wherein modular diagonal geometries are explored, characterized by the use of chamfered corners. In this final iteration, perhaps most noticeably, Kanvende did one thing that his truth-to-material modernist training had so far not allowed him to do. He used stone cladding for his facades. He played up contrasts by using red sandstone and marble. And he also began to use obviously Hindu motifs, but in an abstracted and geometricized manner. The plans were now heavily centered around octagonal geometry. And while these were the broad themes of his work, in tracing authorship, one of my central arguments is that the conditions around the project are unique and the people involved with the project uniquely shape it as well. Rather than assume the myth of the single author, though, I instead take up Audre Lorde's premise. Difference must not merely be tolerated, but seen as a fund of necessary polarities between which our creativity can spark like a dialectic. As Lorde goes on to say, it is learning how to take our differences and make them strengths. For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We cannot use the same criteria to study the work of post-colonial architects that has traditionally been used to document the work of white male architect who fits the trope of a singular genius author. This thesis instead positions itself in the growing body of work that attempts to subvert the West-dominated canonical reading of modernism, instead trying to bring in counter-narratives from the third world. In looking at Kanvende's work, it examines architecture and authorship not just through the development of style and quest for an Indian identity, but also through questioning the trope of architects as sole authors. Works of architecture come out of a process of collaboration and are implicitly shaped by socio-political context and by constraints such as site, climate, and budget. A first step towards rectifying this perception, besides acknowledging individual contributions to each project, is to acknowledge the structure of the firm, its functioning, and the role played by each of the various collaborators in the arsenal of collaborators Kanvende amassed over the course of his career. The key structural component of the firm was the partnership between Achyut Kanvende and Shaukat Rai. Rai was charismatic and the better connected of the two, being the grandson of civil engineer and philanthropist Sir Gangaram, and won them many of their first commissions, including the Sir Gangaram Hospital, at a time when projects were awarded based on clout. Kanvende, unassuming and unconnected as he was, may not have received as many commissions starting out had it not been for Rai. By all accounts, it was a great partnership. Though from entirely different backgrounds, each of the two partners worked in tandem with each other. Murad Chaudhry joined the firm in 1969 when he returned from Kingston in the UK on completing his education. 1965 onwards, Kanvende had become very busy with teaching at universities abroad, and Rai offered Chaudhry a job in order to lighten the workload. Chaudhry became the youngest partner shortly after in 1972. Chaudhry had a reputation for being very fastidious. A popular joke with members of the firm was that Chaudhry would figure out the entirety of the building services and structure himself, and then simply ask the structural engineers, Damle and Naranjan Singh Ruprai, to mark the reinforcements on the drawing within the concrete system. After 2002, the mantle of the firm was taken up by Chaudhry and Tanuja and Sanjay Kanvende. Through its peak between the 60s and the late 80s, there were always about 25 individuals working at the office. The firm started out with in-house structural consultants, Phatak and Damle, and structural consultant V.H. Shah was instrumental in the firm's dairy projects. Another long-time collaborator on public health was S.G. Dulalikar. But multiplicity of authorship, however, really comes across when looking at the firm's collaboration with structural engineer Mahinder Raj. The Sher-e-Kashmir Stadium, for instance, which looks uncannily like the Hall of Nations, authored by Mahinder Raj and architect Raj Rival, just by virtue of its tetrahedron concrete structural system. In architectural production, there's always a lag between original intentions and final creations. However, following Anuradha Iyer Siddiqui's provocation to investigate the architectural beyond the regimes of authorial intent or technical complexity, and instead as a central concept and a subject of historiography and methodology, one can begin to have a more inclusive conception of history. Siddiqui points out that in addition to the well-guarded collections of architects and architecture in South Asia, such as Kanvende's own, there has been a proliferation of institutional and individual attempts to collect and collate raw materials for the South Asian modern environment that have opened up the notion of the architectural archive. To nurture South Asian narratives of the modern. These include the Center for Environmental Planning and Technology Archives, various independent online databases, pop-up dialogue series, as well as parallel efforts concerned with material, aesthetic, and historical meaning making. In keeping with this thesis also attempts to re-examine the accepted way of conceiving of and writing history to instead include personal oral histories and written correspondence to supplement the material archive of written works and architectural drawings. These inquiries into the process of architectural production are made through the project of the National Science Center, New Delhi. A rather important consideration in the selection of the project to study was the evidentiary material, evidentiary documents and drawings that survived, as well as the ability to interview people that worked or collaborated on the project. For most of the projects carried out by Kanvende and Rai between the 1950s and the 60s, little to no evidence survives. Perhaps also self-servingly, I selected the Science Center since I found out through preliminary interviews that there were many roadblocks and tensions in its actualization. Of course, while a single project cannot be taken to stand for the firm's entire body of work, my hypothesis is that similar tensions would have existed in other projects as well, and this may be looked at as a methodology to piece together architectural histories to understand socio-political contexts and acknowledge multiple authorship. A little bit about the project to contextualize it. It was the late 80s and the Indian economy was at the cusp of globalization. It was the end of state patronage, which was the mode that Kanvende was used to functioning in. The National Science Center, constructed on a 7,000 square meter wedge-shaped plot at Pragati Maidan, faces the historic Purana Killa, or the Old Fort in New Delhi. The plot was carved out of Delhi's Trade Fair grounds, and the museum was commissioned by the National Council of Science Museums following the successful completion of Nehru Science Center, Mumbai. The program brief comprised exhibition spaces for displays of varied nature, seminar halls, a library, a children's activity area, training workshops, a cafeteria, a 350-seater auditorium, and a reception area. The 6-story reinforced concrete structure with a base is supported on an in-situ pile foundation. The structural system, designed in collaboration with structural engineer Mahinder Raj, is governed by an alternating grid of 12 meters and 2.75 meters and creates relatively large interconnected column-free spaces. The team that worked on the project from Kanvende, Rai and Chaudhary comprised of Kawaljit Singh, Radhika Vishwanathan, and Poonam Singh. Each of the various materials of the archive or ways of knowing provide different insights into the project. Reading architectural drawings gives insight into spatial configuration and design development. Drawings can be a fairly good indicator of the priorities of the author and are tools to gauge authorial intent. They can also be a preliminary indicator of authorship since the name of the draftsperson generally appears on the format. Narendra Dengle, who worked at the firm, describes Kanvende's reliance on drawings as he trusted his skill of draftsmanship and drawing rather than trying to decode modernism through art and architecture theory. He would not only draw finished drawing works, but also explore all ideas through sketches in a way that was typically modernist. Drawing and watercolor was his forte for visualizing spaces and forms. These unfolded the formal configurations he intended to schematize. Interviews are oral histories. While oral history is liable sometimes to inconsistencies or gaps in memory, depending on how long ago the instances took place, are a good way to glean insight into the process of architectural production. A lot of agreements were reached verbally at the time, for which there are no written records. Executive decisions, changes in design, and the reasons behind them a lot of the time cannot be found in written documentation. Some of the themes that came up during interviews included the removal of the observatory from the design due to height restriction, and in addition to the challenge of site and location, the column size being designed as the width of a brick wall. Text published by the architect, either for dissemination within the architectural community or to clients, can once again be characterized as indicators of authorial intent. These provide a platform for the architect, author, to be able to justify the design, while newspaper and media coverage can give a fairly good indication of the socio-political context or public opinion on the project. The written correspondence, though, was perhaps the most revelatory. The correspondence documents dates on which the letters were exchanged, exact phrasing of exchanges, and both parties' opinion on the architectural profession. This leaves no room for ambiguity, and I will read out a short extract of perhaps the most heated exchange in a letter dated 4th April 1989 between Kanvende and the client. Unfortunately, the architect is often sandwiched between two extreme situations. One, that he can be blamed if he is to cooperate momentarily, ignoring his professional responsibilities towards the project, or alternatively, take initiative and intervene to safeguard the interest of the project. I would like to mention with sincerity that we have acted with fairness and a clear conscience. The manner in which Mr. Mahindaraj felt about this project and how things were going were extremely concerned, as such a thing could affect all those who associated with the project, including architect, promoter, and contractor. Mr. Mahindaraj and I would prefer to meet you sometime and explain so that you can have a clear idea of what he felt after his visit. Your understanding in this matter is very important. I agree with you that promoter is employer. However, architect cannot safeguard his interests effectively merely in the capacity as his employee. Architect is a professional first, and his professional responsibilities demand him to serve clients' interests and maintain professional standards as well. Our professional background can be checked from our past records, as we have associated with your organization now more than 10 years. I observed from past projects which we have completed more than 2 decades, where the people initially associated are retired and gone. However, under new situations, problems are still referred to us for guidance and advice. Architect's responsibility does not end with the completion of the building alone. It is sad that he is often misunderstood. So in conclusion, databases, cataloging, digitizing, but most importantly, in following Albina Yaneva's prompt in crafting history, the act of juxtaposing all these documentary and experimental techniques are necessary to make ephemeral objects archival. Just as we need to expand the canon, we also need to expand the architectural archive, particularly in the Indian context, to include different ways of knowing and knowledge making. In addition to these ways of knowing, I come back again to the house I grew up in, to the issues of legacy and memory bound up with the architectural. The house itself is a live archive or a repository of memories. So to end, I can probably just use Kanvende's own quote where he says, "My buildings are my best memory. No other memory is required." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Architect Tanuja and Vrinda. That was such a well-articulated insight into Kanvende's life and work. And it was so interesting to see his legacy through the lens of your thesis inquiry. We'd like to now invite our moderators for the day, Irushi Gurge and Devi Nair, who will be facilitating a dialogue with the speakers. The audience are welcome to post their questions in the Q&A box below. And before we begin, Professor Anoma would like to make a correction in her presentation. Professor Anoma, over to you.
Are you able to see me?
Yes.
Okay. So in my presentation, I mistakenly said Christopher Fonseca for Michael Fonseca, and it's a a switch of my mind because I was thinking of Christopher de Serum and Michael Fonseca. And I just want to make that correction because Michael Fonseca is a very dear friend, and his daughter is watching this today and messaged me that I had made the mistake. Sadly, he passed away on the 23rd of July. So it was a very sad passing because he had been so involved in the writing of the book as well and supported it. Thanks.
So I'd like to firstly thank Vrinda, Tanuja, and Anoma for retracing these fascinating and equally important narratives, and for bringing back to focus such inimitable legacies that that need so much more acknowledgement. I'd like to start off this conversation with a question for Tanuja and Vrinda. In so many ways, we see that it was Kanvende's vision and efforts that positioned India within a more universal architectural vocabulary, you know, especially at a time when the country was trying to stand up on its own 2 feet. And this kind of functionalist language informed the new emerging Indian identity, offering itself as a site upon which industry and science could meld. And I suppose once architects like Corbusier and Louis Kahn stepped in, there was a tension that unveiled, you know, between Bauhaus functionalism and this new approach of expressing modernism through a traditional spirit. So how do you reckon Kanvende positioned himself, you know, in this juxtaposition?
You know, I think basically what made things easy and the journey a little easy was that they had the backing of the visionary Panditji at that point of time. And that made a huge difference because it's like he was there promoting, you know, and they were wanting to assert that India has come onto its own. They didn't want to take a legacy which, you know, was associated with earlier. So the government was very, very supportive of what they did. And if you saw a large number of projects which they'd done in the early years, were all projects for the government, and they were all of national importance. And Kanvende, obviously, like he mentioned in his own thing, he was very influenced by Gropius and all of what was happening there. And his contemporaries at that time were IMP and the kind. So, you know, one of the pictures that you saw of him at the Harvard School presenting his thesis to Gropius has all these luminaries of that time as his classmates. So he kept up with them. And that also gave them probably a certain encouragement because it was about, you know, establishing yourself parallelly in the world. This is what I can feel. Vrinda, I don't know if you would like to add anything onto it, but
I can add some. So essentially, there's actually a quote of his where he says, "Architectural style is just a skin of bygone times." I don't think he really considered himself. You know, I think he thought he was just experimenting through his career. I don't think he considered himself a staunch modernist in that sense. He thought he was, you know, trying to assimilate with Indian culture. And I think towards the end of his career, if you read his writings, there's almost this sort of disillusionment with modernism, where he says, he calls it the so-called modern movement. And so I think for him, it was just this constant journey and a constant experimentation, which is why I've also positioned his work in terms of iterations, because it was a series of experimentation. It was only that the vocabulary he knew how to experiment in was the modernist one.
Thank you, Tanuja and Vrinda. I think Irushi could start off with the next question.
Thank you so much for the eye-opening presentations on these two luminaries that have been obscured in our architectural history. My question is to Professor Anoma. Valentine's architecture was unapologetically modernist, and clearly there was a client base that style appealed to. The vernacular cosmopolitans, as you say, did prefer Gunasekara's style of architecture. If that was the case, why was it considered unpalatable into the Sri Lankan society? Was that aversion augmented by nationalist sentiments of the post-independence era? And that rejected kind of a Eurocentric identity?
Yes, very much so. Thank you for the question. Very much so. I think that in that kind of post-colonial period, not just nationalist sentiment, but the sentiment towards self-determination took many forms. And I think in art and architecture, there was a tendency to have a kind of sometimes sentimental return to an agrarian past. And I think in Sri Lanka, perhaps it was more pronounced because of the long duration of colonization. I mean, we are talking about 400 years of colonization. Then the desire to link back to that pre-colonial way of living and sensibility was all the more urgent. And I think that is why the aesthetic that, went in that direction had more traction than the modernist approach. But it was also because the middle class was very small, because socialism had actually prevented the middle class from emerging. And it's a middle class that is aspiration and wants to, doesn't want to dwell sentimentally on their origins, because the origins are not as wealthy or empowered, right? So they really want to move forward, and the aspirational aesthetic, which they sought, didn't have the same traction because they were too small a group and didn't have enough capital to make it visible. Thanks.
Thank you. Over to you, Dev.
Yeah, so my next question is for Vrinda. So your conversation on authorship was absolutely fascinating. And I appreciated the way in which you have posed your thesis, by bringing in counter narratives, questioning the trope of architects, and completely reassessing architectural production. When it comes to a country that is as diverse as India, the plurality in space and representation seems inevitable though. So how do you think one can position this sort of reevaluation, in an Indian context?
So of course, one has to acknowledge multiple authors and multiple cultures and methods of drawing even, I think. And also include into the fold different methods of documentation. So though I used written correspondence and letters because I found a wealth of those at the office archives, there's a lot of new institutions and cultural revival that's almost going on. For instance, Ishita Shah started curating for culture, where she's using simple household artifacts that hold a lot of memory, and I think that's a very significant way of. I think we can't dismiss that as part of an archive looking at, and I think that's how we actually broaden the narrative to include various different.
Right. I was just kind of just off that topic. I know that this is a really kind of like a nuanced, perspective. How would you respond to the current sort of pedagogical framework that we have currently, in terms of documentation, in terms of experimentation in the educational sphere. And I'm particularly talking about in the South Asian context.
Well, I suppose, we're sort of in pedagogy, we're a little dismissive of things that are not sort of bound up in the factual or the, the documented or the written. But I think the way to sort of include vernacular or I suppose these counter narratives is to include things that have not historically been used as an archive. And I think that's probably
Yeah.
I think
Thanks.
Noma would be very
yeah.
It would be appropriate for her to kind of answer
Yeah, I
this
think
question,
you should
because I
weigh
think-
in as
Yeah.
well. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, sure. So I think that at the moment what's happened is that we are still in the very pragmatic mode of having professional schools of architecture, and the research culture has not actually developed. And it's only once we have a research culture which allows us to look in the way Vrinda is looking at these topics that we can begin to see them in more complex ways. And alongside that, we have the problem where a lot of the material on architects comes to us through the profession and the profession's monographs, which means that they are representing themselves. They're not necessarily critiquing themselves. So until we have critical insights, just like Vrinda is now beginning to look at, we are not going to have a robust culture of architectural criticism. So I think the main thing is that in this generation who are coming up, like all of you, you need to begin to strengthen the critique and create the oxygen that you can have a critical discourse. And the reason it is slow in architecture as a profession when compared to the social sciences, for instance, is because so much money is tied up with the profession. So if you critique somebody who is actually in practice, the effects of it and the impacts of it are something you have to be very careful about. And so because of that, it's very hard to, create situations that are risky. And this is one of the reasons that, a lot of architects are written out when they're really much later in their careers, written critically about them. And I just feel that, in both Vrinda's presentation and in the book that I wrote, which in some ways was very uncharacteristic for me to write a book on, which looked like a design monograph. And it was really looking at it as an imagination of modernity for a middle class that may be able to write the book in that way, because I'm not someone who would, because I'm not in the profession, I'm not writing as an architect about an architect's practice. So as a historian, for me, writing about an architect and their works is not something I would seek to do. I had to have that other socio-political angle through which to enter the, and if we have more of that, and if that sensibility is improved in our curriculum, the social critique of architecture, that is what we really need to do to come on par with the critical agendas that are occurring internationally.
Yes,
Vrinda, what do you?
absolutely.
I
Yeah.
also want to add on to this. I feel talking about pedagogy itself, I'm talking about in the Indian context. As very rightly mentioned, I think we need to review and re-look at our curriculums, where there is a critical look at what is being done across. So when you typically look at what happens in the 5 years that a student spends, there is very little engagement with this whole aspect of analyzing any work. And it is also, the situation is kind of not so conducive again, because A lot of the schools do not allow the practicing professionals to teach or vice versa. An academia is not allowed to go out and practice. So there is a disconnect. And I think in the aspect of architecture, it's very, very important that you are practicing. And it's only that way that you're able to bring to the table to a student, what you're kind of preaching. Because this aspect of experimentation or analysis or trying out things, so not being molded into just one, but to be able to look at the plurality, like you yourself mentioned, it's very important to give that. So you have to experience that, and it's only then that you're able to give it to the student. So there has to be a shift. And I must admit that when we brought out the book, like I mentioned, it was really so that it would start a lot of these dialogues and the younger generation to look at things differently. So one is, you have the material which is available, because everybody doesn't have access to the material. But once you've got that, then it's much easier for somebody to pick up these smaller aspects and put it in perspective. And I think that will enrich the whole, the profession and the way we are functioning as professionals in the country. That would make a huge difference. So I was very happy when Vrinda turned around at the end of her whole graduate program to say that she was going to look at the work of Kanvende, and, so it was at least a beginning somewhere for what we started off as a monograph. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. So my next question is for Professor Anuma again. So like Vrinda have showed in her presentation, she went through and studied how Kanvende's design philosophy and language changed over different iterations and different time periods. While studying Valentine's work, did you see a similar change in his work, or do you think he stuck staunchly to the modernist style? And do you think that was one of the, why do you think if he didn't change that, why do you think he didn't temper his architectural language to kind of something that is more locally palatable?
So I think if you look, for instance, at the Tevat chapel, and you see how he's trying to create a skirt roof around it, or if you look at the way in which he's presenting the St. Martin de Porres, the chapel in Horana, and when you step back and look at it, it looks like it has a roof. So you can see that as Baba and Minette are taking the roof as a dominant form, and they're using it as a tool of design, really. I mean, they would design roof down, they would plan the roof first, and then, understand how the spaces would connect to the roof. He has the roof there, and he's trying to say, what shall I do with the roof? How can I present it? How can I make it look like a roof, but not be, tiles on timber and asbestos, which is what, Baba and Minette are doing. So as you find, even when you go to the SLI headquarters building, if you look at those elevations, you can see that the roof is the dominant feature, right? So from the front view, you would see it as though a building with a very heavy roof. But if you actually ask what are the materials, it's completely different. So I think he was always struggling with what was happening and how he can make it. But there was a point at which he resisted reproducing the vernacular kind of materiality of roof form. And that, I think, is an interesting internal struggle for him.
Do you think he failed to meet the ideas of the zeitgeist in that, in his attempt to kind of just stick into his ideals and his, like you said, he didn't want to kind of turn and do something that is kind of similar, like more vernacular. So do you think in that sense, he failed to meet the ideals of the zeitgeist?
I think that he was very much a middle-class person who grew up in an urban setting. And he had no connection to like the Valawa architecture. He had no sort of, ancestral village. He didn't have plantations with plantation houses. So there was nothing that he could relate to, unlike, De Silva who grew up in Kandy, surrounded by these buildings, or Baba who came from a wealthy family. So for him to actually adopt these vernacular forms would have been, disingenuous. It was not part of his worldview and not the worldview of his middle-class contemporaries. So I think it's a question of a culture being quite complex, a society being multi-layered, and all the different positions in that society having enough oxygen to be able to represent themselves and feel comfortable in the architecture that they choose. And the political moment demanded that one particular tradition that came from the vernacular would have more significance, right? And I think that's what happened.
Thank you so much, Professor.
Yeah, my next question is for Tanuja. In your practice, in what ways do you integrate or bounce off Kanvende's ideologies? And also, did the crafting of the book leave some sort of impression on you in terms of your practicing journey?
It's interesting. Actually, it was really, we lived together, we're part of the same family, living out of the same space, and working. But Kanvende was never really an overpowering personality. And he was so involved in his work that many a times he would actually forget that I lived in the same house as him. So there was a lot of flexibility that was given. It is only towards the later part of I started my working at the firm with Murad. For a number of years, I worked with Murad, and it's only in the later years that I worked with Kanvende. So he gave a lot of flexibility in what one could do. He always kind of heard what you wanted to do and, kind of tweaked the whole thing around. And so what I'm trying to say is that there was no compulsions ever. And it wasn't also that one felt that burden that I needed to do something in a particular manner. So that exploration was available, and that freedom to explore was available. And while doing the book, of course, it gave a lot of insight. It was actually very introspective for our own selves, because very often in Hindi there is a saying which is "Ghar ki murgi dal barabar," and that is what it was. Even if you had the greatest spread at your house, it would still feel like very normal kind of meal. It was really like that. So we never took Kanvende or what he had done so overly onto ourselves. It's only when we started putting the book together and we heard other people talk about it that we realized what he had done to the profession at large. Because you tend to take things very lightly. And then as a person, Kanvende was quite an introvert. He would never talk about the work. And he also, in his work, he never believed in trying to explain and justify the work. He always believed that he would just do what he wanted, but he would allow the person to experience that space and interpret it. So unlike his contemporaries, you will see that he never wrote about his spaces at all. It's only those little excerpts that I read that probably he had in his mind that he needed to put together a book. And so he must have penned down in the later years when he wasn't really very involved in working just some thoughts. Otherwise, we really don't have too much which was written about the projects. So it has been very enriching, but it has also been, a great freedom. So.
Thank you so much, Tanuja. We are going to take an audience question now. So the question is, given that there are more practitioners than architectural historians, how can the relationship for dialogue and critique occur? Anyone can take it.
I think it's changing very, very rapidly, because today there are a number of schools, the numbers are increasing, the number of graduates are also far greater, but the opportunities also more to look at not just going in for practice, but also look at other ways of experiencing architecture and engaging with architecture. So I'm very hopeful that, this whole thing is going to shift, because if you, after all, we are all global. It's now becoming like one little world. I would never imagine a platform like this, even last year, so easily that one is able to interact. It was so wonderful to see Professor Anuma present the work and the similarities in some of the projects that you showed of Gunasekara and the work which was happening around the same time in our country. It was really amazing to see that. So I feel it's sooner or later it is going to be there, and there are a lot of you youngsters who are going to be doing this aspect of looking more into it and thinking more about architecture and talking about it. And that will actually stem out a different kind of architecture for all of us. Not just a copy paste and a Pinterest architecture, but something which is far more deeper and rooted.
Professor Anoma, any thoughts?
So yes, I think that one of the things that we need to be careful about also is that a lot of the architecture came to us through coffee table books. And I think the coffee table book has its own agenda. So it's important for us, and that was the way in which actually, other than the MIMA books and the MIMA journals, the coffee table book format, which is, including books that look at, say, houses or, these kind of themes, don't allow you to look at the kind of thing that Rinda is talking about, don't allow you to explore those questions. And I think that because of that, people don't take architects that seriously, and that affects the profession, in turn, because people see it as similar to magazine architecture. But if you start showing architecture in this more complex way, I think it will actually help the profession. This is the process we go through. All this stuff happens before you actually have that photograph of the building. Nobody realizes how complex an architect's process is, because we don't talk about it. So that, in a sense, is what we have to start writing about. Rinda, do you have anything?
No, absolutely. I agree with both of them. It was so well articulated. Yeah, I think that about covers it.
Okay, then thank you so much for everything you guys have brought up today. Your presentations were fabulous, and it was really illuminating, and especially as a young architect in oh wait, I think we're getting another question. Never mind. So as a young architect in South Asia, it was very illuminating to actually hear about these luminaries that were quite obscured in history. Thank you. We truly enjoyed your presentations, and thank you so much for shedding light on these South Asian luminaries. I think I will turn it over to Varna and Sakshi now to take it forward.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of Design United, I would like to take this opportunity to express my gratitude to our presenters, Professor Anuma, Architect Tanuja, and Vrinda, for such an inspiring session. With Design United's Legacy Series, South Asian Legacy Series, we aim to bring to fore path-breaking works and approaches, as well as the milieu of these visionary Asian designers through dialogue and to encourage further discussion. So actually, what has been extremely inspiring also is the persistence and passion that the presenting speakers today have shown towards the research, as well as architectural criticism, and in bringing out their books. So I would encourage all our audience to kindly get a copy of the book and to be more familiar with the work expressed here. My sincere gratitude to all from Design United. I hand over this to Sakshi to end with the upcoming Design United events. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Anoma Pieris, Architect Tanuja BK, and Brinda Kanvende for your wonderful presentations and insightful discussion today. Thanks to our moderators, Devi and Ilushi, for an interesting and thought-provoking conversation. We'd like to extend our gratitude to Clayworks for supporting this webinar and all of our webinars. So far, Design United has completed numerous design conversations, and we are so glad to have conducted the first of our South Asian Legacy series today. Professor Anoma Pieris will be releasing her ebook, Imagining Modernity, on the 21st of this month, and we encourage all of our audience to please check that out. Do look out for more updates on our social media page, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel for more such conversations. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience and for engaging with us today. Until next time, stay safe and take care. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Design United.
Yeah. And nice meeting you all also,
Thank you
Tanuja
so
and Brinda.
much.
It was very
Yes.
nice to be